In the early hours of July 7, 1993, a 27-year-old woman named Mia Zapata was walking home through Seattle. She was not an anonymous figure. She was the lead singer of a rising punk band called the Gits, a fierce and gifted songwriter, a visual artist, a magnetic performer, and something rarer still, a powerful woman's voice at the front of a stage, in a music scene that didn't have many of them. People who knew the Seattle scene in the early 90s will tell you she was on the verge of something significant. She had come a long way to chase that, and she was close. She never made it home. Sometime after 2 in the morning, walking through the city, Mia Zapata was attacked. She was raped and she was strangled, and her body was left on a deserted street, less than 2 miles from where her night had started. She was found before dawn by a passerby, and a young woman with an extraordinary future became, instead, one of the most haunting unsolved murders in the history of Seattle. The killing tore a hole through the city's music community, and because it seemed obvious that it must have been someone who knew her, someone who could get close to her on a dark street, a terrible thing began to happen inside that community. Suspicion crept in. Friends began to wonder about friends. Fellow musicians fell under a cloud. A tight, grieving scene slowly began to turn on itself, and no one could prove they weren't the one. For nearly 10 years, that is how it stayed. Investigators had a complete DNA profile of the killer, preserved from the very beginning. It just didn't match anyone. If cases like this one are why you're here, the ones where the answer, when it finally comes, is stranger and more random than anyone imagined, subscribe to Decades Cold and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This is exactly what we do here. And then, in December of 2002, the profile matched. But the match had nothing to do with anyone Mia knew or anyone in Seattle at all. It belonged to a man named Jesus Mezquia, a stranger with a long history of violence toward women who was living 3,000 miles away in Florida. And here is the detail that makes this case unforgettable, the reason I chose to tell it. The only reason his DNA was in the database to be matched at all was a petty crime. He had been convicted, in Florida, of possessing burglary tools, and as a condition of his probation, he'd been required to give a cheek swab. That one small, unrelated offense, almost a decade later and a continent away, is the entire reason the man who killed Mia Zapata was ever caught. Without it, he would very likely have walked free forever. This is the story of Mia Zapata, the artist the world lost, the community that turned its grief into a movement, and the sheer, terrifying randomness of the fluke that finally named her killer. Before anything else, I want to talk about Mia Zapata, the artist, because her bandmates asked the world to remember her that way, for her music and her talent and her humor, and not only for the terrible way she died. So let's honor that. Mia Catherine Zapata was born in 1965 and raised in Louisville, Kentucky. She was musical from childhood. She learned guitar and piano young, and she grew into a genuinely gifted songwriter with a voice that people who heard it never forgot. Raw, powerful, soulful, the kind of voice that seemed too big for the room she was singing in. She moved to the Pacific Northwest and became the frontwoman of the Gits, a band that came up in the same Seattle scene in the same years that gave the world grunge. They were building a real following. There was major label interest circling. By 1993, the Gits were, by any measure, a band on the rise, and Mia was the heart of them. And she represented something specific and important, which is part of why her loss hit so hard. The rock and punk world of that era was overwhelmingly male and often openly hostile to women. Mia Zapata stood at the front of a stage and commanded it, a woman writing fierce, honest, emotionally raw songs and performing them with total authority. For a lot of people, especially young women in that scene, she was a kind of proof that there was a place for them there. The musician Joan Jett, who would later become deeply involved in honoring Mia, put it simply, that Mia's legacy should be beautiful, strong punk rock music coming from a woman's perspective, because that is who she was. Her 3 surviving bandmates, Andy, Matt, and Steve, said years later that rather than focus on her death, they preferred to remember her friendship, her talent, her humor, and the incredible art and music she left behind. I want to hold that up front, because everything else in this episode is about how she died and who killed her, and it's easy for that to swallow the person whole. Mia Zapata was not a true crime episode. She was an extraordinary young artist who was just getting started, and who should have had decades more to make things. What was stolen was not only a life, it was all the music she never got to write. The night of July 6th into July 7th, 1993, was, for most of it, an ordinary Seattle night. Mia spent much of the evening at a bar called the Comet Tavern, a well-known spot in the local music scene. Later, she went to a friend's apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, and at around 2 in the morning, she left that apartment on foot, heading out into the night. She was, as far as anyone knew, simply walking through her own city, in her own neighborhood, the way she and countless others had done 1,000 times. At around 3:20 in the morning, a passerby came upon a woman lying in the street, in a rough but lively part of the city. It was Mia. She had been attacked with terrible violence. She had been raped, and she had been strangled to death. Her body had been left in the open, on a deserted street, less than 2 miles from where she'd started walking. I'm going to leave the specifics of the assault there, out of respect for her. What matters for the investigation is that it was a savage, close-contact attack, and that it happened fast, somewhere in that short walk home, at the hands of someone who got physically close to her in the dark. And the attack left biological evidence. In the course of the assault, the killer left saliva on Mia's body, recovered during the investigation. In 1993, that saliva was preserved, carefully kept, refrigerated, held as evidence. And it was, in a very real sense, the killer's signature, his genetic identity, sitting in an evidence locker. But this was 1993, and the forensic tools of the time could not yet extract a usable, searchable DNA profile from a sample that small. The evidence that would eventually name Mia's killer existed from almost the very first day. It would take nearly a decade for science to learn how to read it, and for the world to build a database it could be read against. I want to spend real time on what happened to Mia's community after her death, because it's one of the most painful and least discussed dynamics in an unsolved murder, and this case shows it with unusual clarity. When someone is murdered in the way Mia was, attacked up close, on a familiar street, late at night, the natural first assumption is that it was someone who could get near her without alarming her, someone she knew. And Mia was embedded in a tight, close-knit music community, a world of bandmates and friends and fellow musicians who all knew each other, played the same clubs, moved in the same circles. So when the investigation could not quickly identify an outside attacker, a slow poison seeped into that community, the fear that the killer was one of their own. Think about what that does to a group of grieving people. They have just lost someone they loved, horribly, and on top of that grief, they're now forced to look sideways at each other and wonder, was it him? Could it have been him? Multiple people within Mia's world fell under suspicion, some formally, some just in the whispers and the sideways glances. And the awful thing about a cloud of suspicion, in the absence of evidence, is that it can't be lifted. If there's no proof you did it, there's also no proof you didn't. So people who had done nothing but lose a friend had to carry, for years, the unspoken possibility that others believed they were a murderer. A community that should have been able to hold each other through the loss was instead subtly fractured by it. Every member a little bit isolated by the question no one could answer. This is a hidden cost of the unsolved case that we don't talk about enough on this channel. It's not only that the killer goes free, and not only that the family grieves without answers. It's that, in the vacuum where the truth should be, suspicion rushes in and poisons the living. For nearly a decade, the people who loved Mia Zapata most were denied not just justice, but the simple ability to trust each other completely. And every one of them was innocent. It would take DNA to prove that, to lift the cloud off an entire community at once, and point, definitively, somewhere none of them had ever imagined. But here is what that same community did with its grief, and it is one of the most genuinely inspiring things I've encountered in any case we've covered. They refused to only be afraid. They turned their loss into action, in two lasting ways. The first was that they took the investigation partly into their own hands. Frustrated by a case that wasn't moving, Mia's friends and fellow musicians raised money, through benefit shows and the sheer will of a community, to hire a private investigator to keep working the case when it might otherwise have gone quiet. The music world rallied around her memory, with major figures lending their names and their talent to the cause. Joan Jett collaborated with the surviving members of the Gits to record and perform in Mia's honor, raising both money and awareness. This was a community that would not let Mia be forgotten and would not let her case be quietly shelved. But the second thing they did is, to me, the most beautiful legacy of this whole terrible story. Out of Mia's murder, a group of women in Seattle founded an organization called Home Alive, a self-defense collective built on a simple, defiant idea that women shouldn't have to live in fear, and that if the world couldn't guarantee their safety, they would teach each other to be safer. Home Alive offered affordable, accessible self-defense training, and it was funded, in part, by a benefit compilation album that drew contributions from across the music world. Some of the biggest names of the era lending songs to the cause. What had been done to Mia, a woman attacked walking home alone at night, became the seed of a movement dedicated to making sure other women had the tools and the confidence to protect themselves. Sit with the meaning of that. The specific horror of Mia's death was that she was a woman, alone, vulnerable on a dark street, at the mercy of a predator, and her community's response was to attack that exact vulnerability head-on, to take the thing that had made her a victim and organize against it, so that her death might make other women harder to victimize. That is what it looks like to wrestle meaning out of senselessness. The killer had taken a powerful woman's voice and tried to silence it, and the answer, from the people who loved her, was to amplify that voice into something that protected thousands of other women for years. Mia's murder remained unsolved through all of that, but her community had already decided that her life would mean something, with or without an arrest. Now let's follow the evidence, because the science in this case is a perfect illustration of a theme this channel returns to constantly: the sample that waits. From 1993 onward, that saliva sample recovered from Mia's body sat in cold storage, refrigerated and preserved. For years, it was, in identifying terms, useless, not because it was worthless, but because the tools didn't yet exist to make full use of it. And then the tools caught up. There was a revolution in forensic science, built on a Nobel Prize-winning breakthrough by the chemist Kary Mullis, a technique that allowed scientists to amplify tiny amounts of genetic material until there was enough to analyze. This is the innovation that made modern DNA testing possible, the ability to take a sample far too small to work with by the old methods and multiply it into a readable profile. It's the same underlying advance that sits behind so many of the cases we cover, where a trace of biological material, once useless, becomes a full genetic fingerprint. Applied to the saliva preserved from Mia's case, that technology finally did what 1993 could not. Analysts were able to extract a complete DNA profile of the man who had left that saliva, the man who killed her. For the first time, investigators had his genetic signature in a form that could be searched. And that word, searched, is the key to everything that followed, because a DNA profile, on its own, is just a string of markers. It only becomes an identity when you can compare it against something. In 1993, there was almost nothing to compare it to. But by the early 2000s there was. The United States had built a national DNA database, a system designed for exactly this purpose. And so, in 2002, investigators took the profile developed from Mia's killer and they entered it into that database to see if the man it belonged to was somewhere inside. The first time they ran it, there was no match. He wasn't in there. Not yet. The database is called CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, and it's worth understanding exactly what it is, because it's the hero and, in a sense, the cautionary tale of this episode. CODIS is a national collection of DNA profiles, maintained by the FBI, containing samples from convicted offenders and from unsolved crime scenes across the country. The idea is elegantly simple. Every time a new offender's DNA is added, the system automatically checks it against all the unsolved crime profiles already in there, and vice versa. So an unsolved case can sit in CODIS for years, dormant, and then suddenly resolve itself the instant the right person's DNA gets entered from somewhere else. That's what investigators call a cold hit. Not a match you went hunting for, but one the database hands you when a new profile drops into place. Mia's killer's profile went into that system carrying nearly 2 million other DNA samples, and at first, as we said, it matched nothing. So investigators did the patient thing. They left it in, and they kept checking, running the sample at intervals, hoping that one day the right entry would appear. For about 6 months, nothing. And then, in December of 2002, almost 10 years after Mia's murder, the system produced a hit. The DNA from Mia Zapata's body matched a profile that had just been entered into CODIS. The name attached to it was Jesus Mezquia, and the strength of that match left no room for doubt. According to court records, the frequency of that DNA profile in the United States population was 1 in 1.5 trillion. 1 in 1.5 trillion. There are only about 8 billion people on the entire planet. A number like 1.5 trillion is so far beyond the human population that it reduces the possibility of a coincidental match to nothing. This was, as one account put it, the genetic equivalent of a smoking gun. After nearly a decade, after the years of cold investigation, the community's suffering, the cloud of suspicion over Mia's friends, the answer arrived not from a detective's hunch, or a witness, or a confession, but from a computer, quietly matching 2 strings of genetic code. And the man it named was someone no one in Seattle had ever heard of. Now we arrive at the heart of this case, the detail that makes it, for me, one of the most thought-provoking stories we've ever told. Because the question you have to ask is, why was Jesus Mezquia's DNA in CODIS at all? What put him there, in December of 2002, to be matched? The answer is almost absurd in its smallness. Mezquia's DNA entered the national database because, in 2002, he had been convicted in Florida of a felony for possessing burglary tools. Not murder, not rape, not a violent assault, possession of burglary tools. And as a condition of his probation for that offense, he was required to submit cheek swabs to give his DNA. That is the only reason his genetic profile was ever collected and uploaded. A minor property crime in Florida nearly a decade after and 3,000 miles away from the murder of Mia Zapata is the single thread by which her killer was caught. I want you to really sit with the implication of that, because it cuts both ways, and both ways are staggering. On one hand, it's a triumph. The system worked exactly as designed. A violent predator was matched to a murder he thought he'd gotten away with, entirely because the machinery of the justice system swept up his DNA over an unrelated crime, and the database did the rest. That is genuinely how CODIS is supposed to work, and here it worked beautifully. But on the other hand, and this is the part that should keep you up at night, it means that Mia Zapata's killer was caught by a fluke. If Mezquia had never been convicted of that particular crime, in that particular state, in those years when they collected DNA for it, his profile would never have gone into CODIS, and that cold hit would never have happened. He could have lived out his entire life, 3,000 miles away, and never once been connected to what he did on a Seattle street in 1993. The DNA profile of Mia's killer sat in the national database, perfect and ready, matching no one. And it stayed that way until a completely unrelated burglary charge happened to drop the missing piece into place. Justice, in this case, was not inevitable. It hinged on a coincidence, and that forces an uncomfortable question about every cold case that hasn't been solved. How many killers are simply the ones whose unrelated fluke never happened? How many perfect DNA profiles are sitting in CODIS right now, matching no one, waiting for a burglary charge that may never come? So who was the stranger the database named? Jesus Mezquia was a man in his late 40s by the time of his arrest, originally from Cuba, who had come to the United States decades earlier. And crucially, the investigation established that he had a real, physical connection to the place and time of Mia's murder. He had been living in the Seattle area in the early 1990s, in the window that mattered, roughly a mile and a half from where Mia's body was found. He was right there, a stranger to Mia, but a resident of the same few square miles. And when investigators looked into his history, a chilling pattern emerged. Mezquia had a documented history of violence, particularly toward women, a record that included assault, domestic battery, and robbery over the years. The women in his life, by multiple accounts, had reason to fear him. And there was one detail that placed his predatory behavior in Seattle in exactly the relevant period: a report of indecent exposure on file against him in the city, right around the time of Mia's murder. Investigators came to believe that Mezquia had not known Mia at all, that he was a predator of opportunity, who simply spotted a woman walking alone late at night and attacked her. Everything that had made the community assume the killer must be someone Mia knew was wrong. It wasn't someone close to her. It was the most frightening kind of killer there is, a violent stranger, passing through, who chose her because she was there, and she was vulnerable. And this is where the DNA did something beyond naming the guilty. It exonerated the innocent, in bulk. Remember the cloud of suspicion that had hung over Mia's community for a decade, the friends and fellow musicians who'd had to live under the unspoken question. In a single stroke, the CODIS match lifted all of it. It proved, with the authority of 1 in 1.5 trillion certainty, that the killer was not any of them. It was not a bandmate, not a friend, not anyone from the scene. It was a stranger from 3,000 miles away. Every person who had been quietly suspected, every friendship that had been strained by doubt, was cleared at once. The same match that condemned Jesus Mezquia liberated an entire grieving community from a suspicion it had never deserved to carry. Once CODIS produced the match, investigators moved to arrest Jesus Mezquia. In January of 2003, he was located and arrested in Florida, and it was a near thing. By some accounts, he had only just left one location as authorities closed in. He was brought back to Washington to face trial for the murder of Mia Zapata, 10 years after the crime. At trial, Mezquia did what cornered defendants in these cases so often do when confronted with undeniable DNA. He admitted the parts he couldn't deny and tried to explain away the rest. He acknowledged that he had lived in Seattle in 1993, in an apartment not far from where Mia's body was found, but he denied ever having met her, let alone killing her. And that left him with the impossible task of explaining how his saliva came to be on the body of a woman he claimed never to have encountered. His defense's attempt at an answer has become almost infamous in true crime circles for its desperation. They suggested the DNA could have gotten there by essentially floating through the air. That was the theory offered to counter a 1 in 1.5 trillion match on biological evidence left during a sexual assault. It was not persuasive. On March 24, 2004, after several days of deliberation, a jury convicted Jesus Mezquia of first-degree murder in the death of Mia Zapata. He was sentenced to around 36 years in prison, close to the maximum allowed under the state law that applied. There was the usual long tail of appeals. At one point, his sentence was overturned on a technical issue and later reinstated, but the conviction itself stood. Jesus Mezquia spent the rest of his life in prison for what he did to Mia Zapata. He died there, behind bars, in January of 2021, at the age of 66. He never gave a reason. He never confessed, never explained, never offered Mia's family or her community the smallest piece of understanding. He simply maintained, against a mountain of genetic proof, that he hadn't done it. And then he died in the prison where the DNA had rightly put him. The Mia Zapata case teaches 3 distinct lessons, and I want to separate them out, because each one matters. The first is about CODIS itself, and it's a double-edged lesson. On the triumphant side, this case is a showcase of what a national DNA database can do. It can reach across a decade and a continent, and connect a murder in Seattle to a burglary arrest in Florida automatically, without a single detective ever suspecting the man. That is an extraordinary capability, and it has solved thousands of cases. But the cautionary side is just as important. CODIS can only match a killer whose DNA is actually in it. Mia's killer was only in it because of an unrelated fluke. And that means the database's power is bounded by an uncomfortable randomness. It catches the offenders the system happens to sweep up for something else, and it stays silent on the ones it doesn't. This case is both the best argument for these databases and a sober reminder of their limits. The second lesson is the one about the innocent, and we've seen it before but rarely at this scale. For 10 years, an entire community lived under suspicion. Good people, grieving people, had their relationships and their reputations quietly shadowed by a question no one could answer. The DNA didn't just catch the guilty man. It cleared all of them, at once, definitively. When we champion this technology for putting killers away, we should remember with equal force that it rescues the wrongly suspected, and that in a case like this, that rescue extended to dozens of people who'd done nothing but love someone who was murdered. And the third lesson is about what a community can do with grief. Mia's people did not wait passively for justice. They funded investigators, they kept her memory alive, and above all, they built something, Home Alive, that took the exact vulnerability that killed her and organized against it, protecting other women for years. The case took a decade to solve, and it was ultimately solved by a database, not by them. But they had already refused to let Mia's death be only a loss. They made it, also, a source of protection and strength for others. That is a model of how to respond to the senseless, and it deserves to be remembered as much as the forensics. Let me end where Mia's bandmates ask us to, with the artist and not only the crime. Mia Zapata was 27 years old. She was a once-in-a-generation kind of voice, a woman who stood at the front of a stage in a world that didn't make much room for women, and commanded it anyway, a songwriter and painter and performer who was, by every account, just getting started. The cruelest arithmetic of her death is not only the years she lost, but the work she never made. The songs unwritten, the records unrecorded, the whole second and third act of an artist's life, erased on a dark street by a stranger who chose her at random. When we say a murder steals a future, in Mia's case that future was measured in art, and all of it is simply gone. And I keep coming back to the randomness, because it's the thing that makes this case haunt me. Mia's killer was not caught because the system was inevitable or because justice always wins. He was caught because, years later and a continent away, he committed a small crime that happened to require a cheek swab. Pull that one thread out of the story, and Jesus Mezquia dies a free man, and Mia's community carries its suspicion and its grief forever, unresolved. Justice here hung by a coincidence. That should make us humble about the cases that haven't been solved, and it should make us fierce about supporting the databases and the science and the patient investigators that turn coincidence into resolution as often as possible. But the last word shouldn't be about Mezquia, or even about the fluke that caught him. It should be about what the people who loved Mia chose to build in the 10 years when they had no answer at all. They didn't have justice, they didn't know who did it, and they still managed to turn her death into a movement that made other women safer, and to hold her memory up as her bandmates wanted it held, as beautiful, strong music from a woman's perspective, because that is who she was. Mia Zapata's killer tried to silence a powerful voice. He failed. That voice is still teaching women to protect themselves, still remembered, still loud. Say her name, Mia Zapata. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe, because the next one is already waiting.